There are tears nobody ever sees. Not because they are unimportant, not because they are small, but because they fall in silence. They fall late at night when the world has already gone quiet. They fall in empty rooms where nobody hears the breaking happening inside your heart. Sometimes they fall while you stare at the ceiling unable to sleep, exhausted from carrying emotions you no longer know how to explain. Other times they fall while you smile in front of people, pretending you are stronger than you truly feel because you are tired of trying to explain pain nobody fully understands. And after a while, something inside you begins to wonder if anyone notices at all. If anyone sees how hard this season has become. If anyone understands how exhausted your soul feels. If God Himself still sees you through all this silence. Because there are moments where pain becomes so quiet that even the people closest to you do not recognize it anymore. You continue moving through life. You continue handling responsibilities. You continue answering people when they speak to you. But deep inside, there is a heaviness growing every day. A hidden sadness. A silent ache that follows you everywhere no matter how hard you try to hide it. At first, you tell yourself you can carry it alone. You convince yourself this feeling will pass quickly. You try to stay strong. You try not to cry. You tell yourself there are people suffering more than you, so maybe you should stop feeling this way. But emotions buried too deeply do not disappear. They wait quietly inside the heart until eventually, the weight becomes impossible to ignore. And the hardest part is not always the pain itself. It is the loneliness inside the pain. Because sometimes what breaks a person most is not what happened to them, but the feeling that nobody truly sees what it did to them afterward. So you become quieter. More careful. More emotionally distant. Not because you stopped caring, but because you became tired of feeling misunderstood. There are nights where you sit completely alone replaying every disappointment, every betrayal, every unanswered prayer, trying to understand why your heart feels so heavy all the time. You whisper small prayers into the darkness hoping God somehow hears the things you cannot say out loud to anyone else. God, are you still there? Do you see me? Do you know how much this hurts? And the silence that follows those prayers can feel unbearable sometimes. Because silence has a way of making pain feel even deeper. The longer heaven seems quiet, the more fear begins whispering things into your heart. Maybe nobody truly sees your suffering. Maybe your tears do not matter. Maybe you are carrying all of this alone. And after enough lonely nights, those thoughts begin sounding believable. That is when exhaustion settles deep into the soul. Not physical exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion. The kind that makes even simple things feel heavy. The kind that steals peace quietly over time. The kind that leaves a person smiling outwardly while silently breaking inwardly. And maybe that is where you are right now. Maybe you have cried tears nobody knows about. Maybe you have carried fear quietly because you did not want to burden anyone else. Maybe you have prayed prayers so weak and exhausted that all you could say was, God, please. Maybe you feel forgotten. Invisible. Emotionally tired in ways words cannot fully describe. But listen carefully now, because this message is for the person who has been suffering silently. For the one who feels unseen. For the one who kept wiping away tears before anyone noticed them. For the one who stayed strong for everyone else while secretly feeling like they were falling apart inside. God is saying, I saw every silent tear. Every single one. The tears you cried in darkness. The tears you held back in front of people. The tears that came from exhaustion, loneliness, fear, disappointment, heartbreak, and waiting. He saw all of them. And not one moment of your suffering was invisible to him. Even when heaven felt silent. Even when life felt unfair. Even when you thought nobody understood the weight inside your chest. God was there. Watching. Listening. Staying near in ways you could not yet recognize. Because sometimes, the moments where you feel most unseen by the world are the exact moments where God is holding You closest without you even realizing it. And maybe tonight, before anything else changes, before the breakthrough arrives, before the answers finally come, your heart needs to hear this truth more than anything else. You were never crying alone. And after enough nights like that, something inside him slowly began to collapse. Not suddenly. Not in one dramatic moment where everything fell apart at once. It happened quietly, little by little, the way exhaustion slowly settles into a person's soul after carrying pain for too long without relief. He still woke up every morning. Still answered messages. Still showed up for responsibilities. But inside, he no longer felt like the same person. At first, he thought he was simply tired. He told himself this difficult season would pass soon. He believed if he stayed strong long enough, eventually peace would return and life would make sense again. But the days kept moving forward while the heaviness inside him only grew deeper. Every disappointment stayed longer in his mind. Every unanswered prayer hurt more than before. Every moment of silence from heaven began feeling personal. And slowly, fear started replacing hope. Not loudly. Quietly. The kind of fear that whispers instead of screams. The kind that follows a person everywhere until they no longer remember what peace felt like before all the pain began. There were mornings where he woke up already exhausted before the day even started. The pressure sitting on his chest never fully left anymore. It followed him into every conversation, every quiet room, every sleepless night. Even moments that should have brought comfort no longer reached him the same way. Music sounded distant. Laughter felt empty. Rest no longer felt restful because his thoughts never truly stopped moving. And the thoughts became unbearable at night. That was when everything grew louder. The memories. The fears. The questions. Especially the questions. Why does it still hurt this much? Why does God feel silent? How much longer can I keep carrying this? Again. And again. And again. The repetition slowly wore him down emotionally. Not because the thoughts were dramatic, but because they never fully disappeared. They waited quietly beneath the surface all day long until silence returned at night and gave them space to speak again. And eventually, he became afraid of silence itself. Because silence meant being alone with his own thoughts. Alone with the sadness. Alone with the fear that maybe nothing would ever truly change. That fear began changing him in ways he barely noticed at first. He became quieter around people. More emotionally distant. More careful with his words. Not because he stopped caring, but because he no longer had energy to explain what was happening inside him. How do you explain invisible pain to people who only see your outward life? How do you explain emotional exhaustion that has no visible wound? So instead, he carried it silently. And silent suffering has a way of becoming heavier over time. There were nights he sat completely alone staring into darkness for long periods without realizing how much time had passed. Sometimes he would whisper prayers so quietly they almost disappeared before leaving his lips. God, please. That was often all he could say now. Not long prayers. Not confident prayers. Just exhausted ones. Because his heart had become too tired for anything more. And still, heaven often seemed silent. That silence wounded him deeply. Not because he completely stopped believing in God, but because suffering changes how silence feels. At first silence feels temporary. Then confusing. Then painful. And eventually, after enough waiting, silence begins feeling like abandonment. That was the place he had reached now. Emotionally exhausted. Spiritually tired. Quietly breaking beneath the weight of everything he carried. He started questioning himself constantly. His worth. His purpose. His faith. The confidence he once carried disappeared slowly until even simple decisions felt emotionally heavy. He replayed old conversations in his mind wondering if he had somehow failed the people around him, failed himself, maybe even failed God somehow. Because pain always tries to make suffering feel personal. And after enough lonely nights, those lies begin sounding believable. He stopped expecting joy. Stopped imagining breakthrough. Stopped believing victory could truly happen for someone who felt this emotionally broken inside. Instead, survival became his entire focus. One more day. One more night. One more prayer. That was all he could manage emotionally now. And survival is exhausting when it stretches on too long. There were moments where he genuinely wondered how much more his soul could carry before something inside him finally collapsed completely. The pressure had become constant. The fear had become familiar. The loneliness had become normal. And the worst part was how invisible all of it felt to everyone else. People still saw him functioning. But they did not see how close he was to breaking internally. They did not see the tears he wiped away before anyone noticed. They did not hear the silent battles happening inside his mind every single night. They did not know how many times he almost gave up emotionally before somehow forcing himself to keep moving forward one more day. And maybe that loneliness hurt more than the suffering itself. Because pain becomes heavier when a person feels unseen inside it. But even then, even while exhaustion consumed so much of his heart, something remained alive deep inside him. Small. Fragile. Almost hidden beneath all the fear and sadness. But alive. A quiet part of him that still reached toward God even while struggling to understand the silence. A weak little voice that still whispered. Hold on. He could not explain why it remained. Because logically, he felt exhausted beyond words. Emotionally, he felt close to collapse. Spiritually, he felt lost inside waiting and unanswered prayers. And yet, something inside him refused to completely let go. Even after all the tears. Even after all the loneliness. Even after all the nights where heaven felt painfully quiet. That fragile hope remained. And maybe that was because God was still there too. Watching every silent tear. Holding him together in ways he could not yet see. Preparing something greater in the middle of the very season that felt like the end of everything. And that was when the suffering became deeper than sadness. It became part of the way he moved through life. Every morning felt heavy before the day even began. Every night felt longer than the one before it. And somewhere between those endless days and sleepless nights, he slowly stopped recognizing himself. There was a time when he used to feel alive inside. A time when hope came naturally. A time when he believed difficult seasons always passed quickly and that God would never let him stay in darkness for too long. But now everything felt different. The silence had lasted longer than he expected. The pain had settled deeper than he thought possible. And after carrying hidden sorrow for so long, something inside him became tired in ways words could no longer fully describe. Not physically tired. Soul tired. The kind of exhaustion that sits quietly inside a person until even breathing through another day begins to feel emotionally heavy. At first, he tried fighting against it. He forced himself to stay hopeful. Forced himself to smile around people. Forced himself to believe breakthrough was just around the corner. But the longer the suffering lasted, the harder it became to keep pretending. Because hidden pain changes a person slowly. Quietly. Almost invisibly. He stopped feeling excitement about the future. Stopped expecting good news. Stopped imagining life becoming beautiful again. Hope itself became difficult to carry because hoping meant risking disappointment again. And after enough disappointment, the human heart begins protecting itself by expecting less from life. That was where he found himself now. Not fully broken. But dangerously close. There were nights where he sat completely alone in silence for hours, staring into darkness while thoughts moved endlessly through his mind. He replayed every painful memory over and over again, searching desperately for meaning inside all this suffering. Why does it still hurt this much? Why does God still feel silent? Why do I feel so alone? Again. And again. And again. The repetition slowly exhausted him emotionally. Those thoughts followed him everywhere now. Into every quiet moment. Every empty room. Every sleepless night where fear became louder than faith. And eventually, silence itself became painful. Because silence gave his fears room to speak. Fear told him he was forgotten. Fear told him nobody truly understood him. Fear told him this pain would never end. And after enough lonely nights, those lies began sounding believable. That frightened him. Because deep down, he still wanted to trust God. But suffering has a way of making trust feel fragile. Especially when prayers seem unanswered for too long. There were moments where he tried praying but could barely find words anymore. His heart felt too exhausted for long prayers now. Sometimes he would simply whisper into the darkness. God, please. And then silence would return again. Heavy silence. The kind that presses against the soul until a person begins questioning everything. Not only their future. Not only their strength. Even their faith. He began wondering if maybe he had disappointed God somehow. Maybe he had failed in ways he could not see. Maybe the silence meant heaven had stepped away from him. He hated those thoughts, but they kept returning every time exhaustion weakened his heart again. And exhaustion was constant now. He carried it everywhere. People still saw him functioning. Still moving through life. Still answering when spoken to. But they did not see how emotionally fragile he had become internally. They did not see how much effort it took just to appear normal. They did not see the nights where tears quietly fell while nobody was watching. Those were the hardest moments. The private ones. The moments where the pain finally became too heavy to hide. Moments where he sat in darkness trying desperately not to cry because crying made the loneliness feel even more real somehow. But eventually the tears came anyway. Quiet tears. Exhausted tears. The kind that come from carrying too much for too long without relief. And what hurt most was not just the suffering itself. It was the feeling of being unseen inside it. Because there is a unique kind of pain that comes when a person feels like nobody truly notices how deeply they are struggling. People may see the surface. They may see your routines, your responsibilities, your smile. But they do not see the hidden battles. They do not hear the silent prayers. They do not feel the emotional weight sitting on your chest every single day. And slowly, loneliness becomes part of the suffering itself. He stopped talking about his emotions because explaining them felt impossible now. How do you explain exhaustion that lives inside the soul? How do you explain feeling emotionally overwhelmed all the time while still trying to survive normal life? So instead, he stayed quiet. And quiet suffering always grows heavier over time. Days started blending together. Morning became night before he even noticed. Time itself began feeling empty because every day carried the same emotional weight. The same fear. The same sadness. The same silent ache sitting inside him no matter where he went. And after enough pain, even peace starts feeling unfamiliar. That was what scared him most. Not just the suffering. But how long it had lasted. Long enough to change him. Long enough to make joy feel distant. Long enough to make hope feel fragile. Long enough to make him wonder if he would ever feel whole again. There were moments he genuinely believed he had reached the limit of what his heart could survive emotionally. Moments where everything inside him felt numb from carrying too much sadness for too long. Even simple things became difficult sometimes. Resting. Smiling naturally. Feeling emotionally present around people. It all required energy he no longer seemed to have. And still, despite all of it, despite the exhaustion, despite the silence, despite the endless nights of hidden tears, something inside him refused to completely die. Small. Weak. Almost invisible beneath all the pain. But alive. A fragile little part of him that still listened for God even in silence. A quiet little voice that still whispered. Hold on. He did not understand why that hope remained. Because emotionally, he felt shattered. Mentally, he felt exhausted. Spiritually, he felt lost in waiting. And yet, something deep inside him still believed that maybe this story was not over yet. Maybe the silence was not abandonment. Maybe the tears were not unseen. Maybe the suffering itself was not meaningless after all. He could not fully explain it. But even in the deepest part of his pain, he could never completely stop reaching toward God. And maybe that was because God had never stopped holding on to him either. Because sometimes, when suffering reaches its deepest point, when the heart feels too exhausted to keep pretending, when tears fall silently in darkness and nobody else seems to notice, heaven is closer than it feels. Watching. Listening. Holding every broken piece together quietly. Preparing healing long before the wounded heart can recognize it. And though he could not see it yet, the very season that looked like emotional destruction was becoming the place where God would eventually rebuild him stronger than before. God. I do not know how to carry this pain anymore. I have tried to stay strong for so long. Tried to keep smiling. Tried to keep believing that things would get better soon. But tonight, I am tired in ways I cannot fully explain. Not only physically tired. Deep inside. Soul tired. The kind of exhaustion that follows me into every quiet moment and waits for me every morning before the day even begins. And honestly, I do not know what to do with all these emotions anymore. There are nights where I feel completely alone. Nights where the silence feels heavier than words. Nights where fear becomes louder than peace and my own thoughts begin pulling me deeper into sadness. I replay every disappointment, every unanswered prayer, every hidden tear, and sometimes I wonder if anyone truly sees how much this season has hurt me. But you see it, God. At least. I want to believe you do. Because some nights I feel invisible. I feel like I am carrying pain nobody understands. People see me functioning. They see me continuing life. But they do not see the heaviness inside my chest. They do not see the nights where tears quietly fall after everyone else is asleep. They do not see how emotionally exhausted I have become from trying to survive this season without falling apart completely. And maybe that is why I am here now. Because I cannot keep pretending I am okay anymore. God, if you are still close to me, please let me feel it somehow tonight. Not through something dramatic. Not through immediate answers. Just through peace. Even small peace. Enough peace to remind me I have not been abandoned. Because lately, the silence has frightened me. There were times when trusting you felt simple. Times when prayer felt alive. Times when I believed with confidence that you were guiding every step of my life. But now I feel weak. I feel uncertain. I feel emotionally worn down from carrying hidden sadness for so long. And I hate admitting that. I hate how fragile my heart feels now. I hate how fear keeps whispering things into my mind late at night. What if nothing changes? What if this pain never leaves? What if God has gone silent toward you? Again. And again. And again. Those thoughts exhaust me, God. They follow me everywhere. And some days, I become so tired from fighting them that I no longer know how to quiet my own mind anymore. So tonight, I bring all of it to you. The fear. The sadness. The loneliness. The exhaustion. The silent tears nobody else saw. I place it all before you because I do not know how to carry it by myself anymore. God, please stay near me in this season. Even if my faith feels weak. Even if my prayers feel exhausted. Even if all I can offer you tonight are broken words and tired tears. Please do not turn away from me now. Because somewhere beneath all this pain, there is still a small part of me reaching toward you. Even now. Even after all the disappointment. Even after all the waiting. Even after all the nights where heaven felt painfully quiet. Something inside me still wants to believe you are here. So help me hold on to that. Help me hold on to you when fear becomes louder than faith. Help me trust you when I cannot understand what you are doing. Help me remember that silence does not mean abandonment. Because right now, my heart feels fragile. And I need you more than ever. God, heal the places inside me that nobody else can see. Heal the exhaustion living deep inside my soul. Heal the sadness I keep hiding behind smiles. Heal the fear that keeps stealing my peace. Heal the loneliness that has wrapped itself around my heart during this season of waiting. And when I grow tired again tomorrow, because I know I will, please remind me gently that you are still walking beside me even when I cannot feel you clearly. Remind me that every tear mattered. Every silent cry mattered. Every sleepless night mattered. Nothing was invisible to you. Because some nights, all I need is the reassurance that my suffering is not meaningless. That these tears are not falling into emptiness. That you are still listening even when heaven feels quiet. God. I surrender the weight I have been carrying for too long. The pressure to stay strong. The pressure to pretend I am okay. The pressure to keep controlling everything because I am afraid of falling apart if I let go. Maybe I was never meant to carry all of this alone. Maybe that is why my soul has become so tired. So tonight, I release it into your hands. The future I cannot control. The answers I do not have. The fears I keep hiding. The sadness I no longer know how to explain. I place it all before you. And even though part of me still feels afraid, another part of me believes you are still here in the middle of this darkness. Watching. Listening. Holding me together quietly. So please, stay close tonight. Stay close through the silence. Stay close through the waiting. Stay close through the tears nobody else sees. And when this painful season finally ends someday, let me look back and realize that even during my weakest nights, I was never crying alone. And then, after all the silent tears, after all the nights where his heart felt too heavy to keep pretending, after all the moments where he wondered if heaven had forgotten him, God finally began speaking in a way his soul could no longer ignore. Not through loud miracles at first. Not through instant answers that suddenly removed every problem. It began quietly, deeply, in the middle of a silence that once terrified him. Because sometimes, God waits until a person reaches the end of their own strength before revealing the strength of his presence. That night felt different somehow. Nothing around him had changed yet. The same problems still existed. The same uncertainty still surrounded his future. The same unanswered questions still lingered in his mind. But something inside him had grown too exhausted to keep fighting alone anymore. So for the first time in a very long while, he stopped trying to hold everything together. He sat there in silence. Not forcing hope. Not pretending strength. Not trying to understand every painful thing that had happened. Just sitting honestly before God with all his fear, all his sadness, all his exhaustion exposed completely. And in that quiet moment, something shifted. Not outside. Inside. A peace entered his heart so gently he almost missed it at first. Not overwhelming peace. Not dramatic peace. A quieter kind. The kind that arrives softly after a soul has cried for too long. And suddenly, in the middle of that silence, he realized something that changed everything. God had seen every tear. Every single one. The tears he cried alone at night. The tears he hid from people during the day. The tears that came from exhaustion, disappointment, fear, loneliness, and heartbreak. None of them had been invisible to heaven. And that realization broke something open inside him. Because for so long, he thought silence meant abandonment. He thought unanswered prayers meant God had stepped away from him. He thought suffering meant he had somehow been forgotten. But now, sitting there with tears quietly falling again, he understood something deeper than answers. God had been there the entire time. Watching. Listening. Holding him together quietly while he thought he was falling apart completely. And once that truth reached his heart, the silence no longer felt empty anymore. It felt holy. Suddenly he could see the painful season differently. Every sleepless night. Every disappointment. Every moment he thought he would emotionally collapse. At first he believed those things were destroying him. But now, he realized God had been rebuilding him in places nobody else could see. The suffering had exposed fears hidden deep inside him. The waiting had stripped away false dependence on control. The loneliness had pushed him closer to God than comfort ever could. And little by little, transformation began. Not all at once. Not perfectly. But deeply. The fear that once controlled his thoughts started losing power over him. Not because life suddenly became easy, but because now he understood something stronger than fear itself. God was still with him. Even in silence. Even in suffering. Even during the nights where he felt emotionally shattered. That truth steadied him in ways nothing else could. He stopped waking up every morning expecting disaster. Stopped assuming every silence meant rejection. Stopped believing every painful season meant his story was ending in defeat. Instead, he began moving through life differently. Softer. Calmer. More grounded. Because now he carried something deeper than temporary emotions. He carried the certainty that God had never abandoned him. And that certainty slowly transformed everything. He began noticing small moments of grace everywhere. Quiet reminders that heaven had been moving all along even when he could not see it clearly. Strength appearing exactly when he thought he had none left. Peace arriving unexpectedly during moments where fear once overwhelmed him. Tiny doors opening after long seasons of silence. Conversations arriving at the perfect time. Small mercies that reminded him God had never stopped watching over his life. And the more he noticed those things, the more trust grew naturally inside him. Not forced trust. Not desperate trust. Real trust. The kind born through suffering. The kind that survives silence. The kind that remains standing even after disappointment tries to break it repeatedly. He realized now that God had not wasted any part of his pain. Not one tear. Not one sleepless night. Not one moment where he felt weak and emotionally exhausted. Every painful part of the journey had shaped him into someone different. Someone deeper. Someone stronger. Someone who no longer depended entirely on visible answers to believe God was near. That transformation changed the way he saw himself too. Before, he viewed his tears as weakness. Now, he understood they were proof he had survived seasons that could have destroyed him completely. Before, he viewed silence as rejection. Now, he understood silence often becomes the place where God does his deepest healing work inside the soul. And slowly, the version of himself shaped by fear began disappearing. The hopeless version. The exhausted version. The version that believed he was forgotten. All of it was fading. Because now he knew something he could never unknow again. God sees silent tears. Not just the public pain. Not just the obvious suffering. The hidden tears too. The ones nobody else notices. The ones cried quietly in darkness after everyone else is asleep. The ones that come from carrying emotional weight for too long without relief. God sees every one of them. And once a person truly understands that, loneliness begins losing its power. Because even in the darkest nights, they realize heaven never looked away. That truth transformed him completely. Not into someone harder. Into someone more compassionate. More patient. More understanding of hidden pain in others. Because now he knew how many people smile outwardly while silently breaking inwardly. He knew how many people carry invisible battles every day while pretending to stay strong. And because God met him tenderly in his suffering, he became gentler with the suffering of others too. And one day, looking back at everything he survived, he realized something powerful. The season he begged God to end had actually brought him closer to God than any comfortable season ever had. The tears changed him. The waiting changed him. The silence changed him. Not by destroying him. By rebuilding him from the inside out. And standing there at the end of that painful chapter, one truth became clearer than anything else. Not one tear had been wasted. Not one cry had gone unheard. Not one moment of silent suffering had escaped the eyes of God. Because while the world saw someone quietly struggling, heaven saw someone being transformed into a stronger soul than before. And now, even when difficult seasons come again someday, he will never face them the same way. Because once a person discovers that God stayed beside them through every silent tear, fear never fully owns their heart again.